Well, I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about this issue, and I hope that you're really interested in it. I talk about racial equity and inclusion and economic equity all over the country, and I find that some people don't really know what that has to do with them or what it has to do with what they're doing. So I want to start off by talking about why we all need to be concerned about equity. There are a couple of things driving this moment, and they are, one, the shifting demographics. You know, and I'm sure you've heard it, that by 2044, the nation will be majority people of color. What we often don't know is for the past 5 years, since 2012, the majority of all babies born in this country have been of color. By the end of 2019, that's right around the corner, the majority of all children in the nation under 18 and under will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. And so when we say 2044, that's really today. Because when we think about who's in the public schools, who's in the neighborhoods looking to buy houses, who's really driving the workforce, we already are a nation in which we have to be very concerned about what's happening with people of color, because the fate of the nation is going to be pretty much dependent on what happens with people of color, since they're going to make up the majority of the nation. Unfortunately, we as a nation have been disproportionately leaving behind the very people who are going to make up the future. So the other thing that we need to be concerned about is inequality. Now, we have always had some level of inequality, and for many, many years, until recently, leading economists actually thought that inequality was good for growth. That notion has been turned on its head. The International Monetary Fund did a study of 100 countries and that found for every 10% decrease in inequality, there was a 50% lengthening in the period of growth. The Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland has come to the same conclusion, and my colleagues Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner have done a study looking at the 100 largest regions in the United States, and they're seeing a similar pattern. So we now know that inequality is not good for the prosperity that we seek, and inequality is growing. It's not inequality in and of itself, but this toxic inequality that's hollowing out the middle class, baking in poverty, and making economic mobility almost a thing of the past. That toxic inequality combined with the shifting demographics really is something that we all need to be concerned about. And on top of that, we're at a moment, which could be good, it could be bad, where we are deep in a conversation about race. Could be good because the conundrum of how to deal with the institutionalized racism that predates the very country has always been a problem. And talking about it is certainly a step in the right direction. Unpacking it, understanding how it's led to where we are now and how we're going to have to deal with it with specificity in order to be able to address the challenges I just pointed out is very positive. So I like to think that this is a positive moment as we begin to think seriously about race. So when you think about today and look to the future, there's no question that we have to find and get behind the solutions that allow us to overcome the angst and the history of racism, that allow us to be able to shrink inequality and begin to unleash the prosperity that we know could be there if we make sure that the people who are going to be the future are prepared to lead, to work, to innovate, to do all of the things that we know are going to be needed to have a robust economy, to have a vibrant democracy, and to have communities that we feel good about. I actually think that equity is the superior growth model going forward. So if those ideas make you curious about equity, what it is and how we achieve it, the good news is there are lots of models and strategies that we know work. When I use the term equity, and I certainly should define it in an atmosphere in which people think of equity in a different way from the way that I'm going to define it, when I say equity, I'm referring to just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And the work of equity is to create the conditions to allow that to happen. You can contrast it with equality, a term in which people are much more comfortable with when they're thinking about issues of opportunity and civil rights and all of those kind of issues. Equality often is focused on making sure that the inputs are the same. We often think of equality in terms of education, making sure that children, without regard to where they live or what their race, go to school for the same amount of time, have teachers who are similarly prepared, have curriculum and textbooks that are the same. And the hope is that if we could get those inputs the same, we would get the outcomes that we want. Equity asks, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes? And then backs into what the inputs need to be. For example, children who live in communities that are full of extracurricular activities, whose parents have the resources and the time to make sure that they get all the support they need, will need less to reach their full potential in the educational system than children who live in communities that are barren in terms of access to fresh fruits and vegetables. There are no place for children to be able to play. Parents who don't have the resources to make sure that children get all the inputs they want. That's going to take more. So we don't look for the same inputs. We ask, how do we define what reaching your full potential looks like and then back into what that's going to take? So equity is what it is that we're trying to achieve. When PolicyLink talks about equity, we always think of it in relationship to place. Because sadly, we live in a nation in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity. You tell me where you live, and I can tell you way too much about your circumstance, your outcome, and even how long you will live. And so we need to think about equity in relationship to community and place and neighborhood and city, because the two are so intertwined. We can't really create an atmosphere in which people can reach their full potential if we're not thinking about what's going on in places. And so we think that regional equity, in addition to racial equity, is a very good way to be able to frame your thoughts about what can work. Regional equity just suggests that in a region, and a region really is a wonderful way to organize your thinking about this, because it's regions that compete in the global economy, not cities, not states, but regions, not the nation, regions. And in a region, people ought to have access to opportunity throughout the region. And in a region, we have learned as we have had experiences like Michigan and Detroit, that a region can't thrive with a hole in the donut. So we have thought about regional equity as a way to make sure that people can access all the opportunity and regions can access all of the contributions of all the people who live there. That's a good way to think about it, but we don't get there unless you really focus on the process of equitable development. Equitable development. So that as the development is happening, you're thinking about the region, you're thinking about participation, you're thinking about equity, you're thinking about place and how place can support people in order to really thrive. And I think of several principles of equitable development. One is to really integrate people with place. People with place. Not to develop things like job training programs over here and a transit system over there without thinking about how the transit system is going to be able to access a local workforce and make sure that that workforce is prepared for those jobs. Not to think about the incarceration problem over here and the housing problem over there without understanding that people who are return to communities, and we need to make sure that people can get stable housing, and often housing that's connected with other issues. So always integrating the people strategies with the place strategies. Another principle of equitable development is to think about catalytic investments that produce economic returns, but also returns for people, benefits for community, and sustainable for the environment. Thinking about those things all as being equally important and catalytic as they work together. To think about development in a way that actually reduces disparities. Why should we just accept that these communities have not and these communities have everything and just keep developing in ways that reinforce that? We need to develop in ways that reduce those disparities. And we need to understand that it is imperative that in the development process that's going to impact the lives of people, that people have a voice in what's going on. That voice and participation is just so essential. The voice should be there in terms of decision-making about what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how we're going to measure whether or not it's effective, how to hold it accountable in terms of continuing to provide the benefits that we say that development is going to provide the community. That engagement is absolutely key. As we think about that, there are lots of examples. We know that affordable housing is a tremendous problem. There is nothing that breaks my heart more than to see communities where low-income people of color, Black and Latino, have been in communities during the bad times, when there were no grocery stores there, when the streets were not safe, when there was no transit, where there were no jobs, where there was no beautification, where there were no parks that you can get in. People who have been there during those bad times wanting that? No, they didn't want that. They wanted a community in which their children could thrive. And then just when those things start to come, they get pushed out. That we cannot keep doing that. We can't keep doing it because it's not fair, but we also can't keep doing it because the very people we're pushing out are the people we are dependent on for the future. We have to figure out how to live together, but we also have to give people access to communities that allow them to thrive. When you think back about regional equity, there are several ways to get at it. One is to make sure that everybody can live in a community of opportunity. That requires affordable housing throughout the region. Another is to make sure that people can connect to opportunity wherever it might be in the region. That requires transportation. That requires job linkage programs. But the highest form, the very highest form of regional equity is for every community to be a community of opportunity. And we see that happening. We see that happening across the country as we see communities coming back. We see wonderful things happening, but they always are in passing. In passing. You have a community, it's a community that's been neglected. People start to invest in the community starts to get better. People notice, oh, this is a convenient place to live. It's in a city, let me live there for a moment. You have this beautiful integration where people are living together, and then it passes. The people who were there get pushed out, other people come forward, so we need to bake in affordability in the beginning when we begin developing in communities that have suffered from disinvestment. If you're going to do a redevelopment process, assume success and bake in affordability. There are examples of that all across the country. One of the things that even when the horse is out of the barn and gentrification is happening, you can still get in front of it. Oakland, California is trying to do that with a housing roadmap where they absolutely have looked with community and with city government at all the things they need to do to move forward. We know that communities often need economic activity, and poor Black communities often have no grocery stores. The Healthy Food Financing Initiative coming out of the federal government now has $1 billion on the street, over 1,000 grocery stores and other places to get fresh fruits and vegetables, many thousands of jobs in communities, the ones that have been left behind, but make sure that all the other things go with that. In the Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, as they were doing their light rail line, they made sure that the entrepreneurs in the low-income communities of color could stay in place, could gain benefit. One of the things that we often forget is that people who are Asian, Latino, and African American start businesses at 3 times the rates of people who are white. And they're the ones who are most likely to hire the very people we know that need jobs. But yet, we're not constantly thinking about how we position those entrepreneurs, how we finance those entrepreneurs, how we connect them to networks. And when that's happening in the development process, we're contributing to equity. The last thing I want to say is equity is not a zero-sum game. So you don't need to worry about, well, yes, we want to focus on that, but then we have to take away from something else. You have to take away from a thing, because it works like the curb cut. The curb cuts in the street when you're walking, they are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. They had rights, but those rights were hollow. If they couldn't maneuver, and you see them, you think about them all the time. But how many times have you been pushing a stroller and been so happy you didn't have to pick that contraption up? Pulling a wagon, pushing a cart, or like me, dragging a suitcase and making that train because you didn't have to break your stride. When you solve problems for those who are most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. And equity is like that. Equity is superior growth model. Thank you.